Hey, Pichinas, amazing internet and beautiful creatures of the beyond. Hope you guys are having an amazing day because today we're going to unleash chaos, pleasure, happiness, and whatever else we can think about. But no, today we're going to talk about vulgarity. Now, vulgarity, in its simplest definition, is something crude or something, in quotes, tasteless. But we all know what it means to be vulgar. Like, I remember this time when it was a very, very long time ago. And there was this company that put this announcement out there that they wanted somebody to promote their products. And you see people in stores, those guys that are like, hey, want to try this new product and see if you like it. And that was one of me. And there were some pastry products. I can't remember exactly. It was something related to pastry, and they weren't extraordinarily good. They weren't extremely cheap either, but somewhere along those lines. And there were people there that were going around, and obviously they were not very interested in what I was trying to present to them or sell in quotes. But I did my job. And after some time, I got hungry. And since these guys just gave me the products and they didn't give me anything else like money in my lunch break and so on to eat. I said to myself, well, I can eat some of these products. They're gonna not gonna mind. I know I'm saying a lot because I'm getting a little pressure in my mind if when I remember this episode. And I ate a bag of chips, I think, and a corn or something stupid like that. And they were watching me on the camera. And at the end of the day, when I went in to give back the products, minus the two that I ate, they said, you have to pay for them. And I was like, but I am promoting your products and you're earning money out of this, potentially more sales, and you are getting so pity in this sense that you want me to pay for two simple articles. They weren't expensive or anything, but it's the principle. And they were like, yeah, yeah, and they were very mean. And I was like, you know what? Take these products and shove them up your, and I'll let you continue that phrase. I don't have, you know what I mean. And I just left. So vulgarity can have multiple purposes. It can be offensive. Sometimes it can get your point across, and sometimes it can be even funny. It depends on you how you set up the context. So let's take a word. Let's say ugly. If I come to you and I say, hey, you're ugly, you're going to associate that. Well, obviously, ugly is not one of the broader words of vulgarity that you can select from the plethora that they are. But I'm just selecting a simple example. I'm going to say you're ugly, and in your mind, you're going to associate this to something unpleasant, negative. And of course, that's going to bring out negative emotions in you. But if I say, hey, look at that chair, it's ugly, you're going to look at that funky looking chair and you're going to start laughing within yourself a little bit, depending on how the chair looks, of course. But vulgarity is so much subtle in art because if we look back to the 19th century, which was a very complicated era, it was the era that brought forward the industrialization of the world. We started getting trains and people started moving around and there was commerce and so on. So the world started getting in motion. And up until that time, the big academic organizations from France, because France was the epicenter of art at that time. They were very traditional, and they wanted art to have standards, let's call them. And what were mainly the standard of that time? In principle, they were trying to idolize specific characters or events. Like, think of Napoleon. They were trying to present him in the light of a hero in 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 France, for example. But then there were two movements that were born in that era, and I think they are partly an effect from industrialization of the world, because more people started circulating and more artists came to France. And the two movements that I'm talking about are called realism and idealism. And idealism came a little bit later than realism. But what is idealism and realism in simple terms? Well, first of all, idealism is a philosophical approach of ideas and feelings that challenge the fundamentals of reality. So it wasn't perfection they were seeking, it was fantasy. Whereas realism usually goes against idolizing all of these magnificent heroes and figures, and gets out of its way just to present a more mundane life, and tries to capture those simple moments in time, like somebody sitting at a table thinking of something, having a little coffee. It's like taking a snapshot, a picture in time of a person that doesn't even notice that you're there. Just as like we're looking right here on our screen and we see our artist in the background and he's doing his thing, he's in his thoughts. That's exactly what happens with realism. And the society that was very traditional and saw these new movements, they were very appalled. And every artist that came to present their art or expose their art in their galleries, they were expelled or turned away. And later on, all of these artists that were not very conventional just band together and created their own expositions. And it turns out that a lot of people were interested to see their art because it was so different. And let's take an example of Paul Gauguin. If we look at his art, we're gonna see a lot of simplicity, a lot of cartoonish figures, things childs would paint at a first glance, of course. But the moment you start looking at the composition and what the story is presented in there, and how he plays with nudity in such a way that it's so natural. Let's remember that in that time, people were very severely limited by Christian beliefs or religious beliefs, depending on where they lived, but especially in France. And it was very controversial. He was a very controversial person. He was actually, well, we'll talk a little bit later about him in in contrast to another artist. But simplicity can sometimes give birth to complexity on its own, because when we see these figures, their colors and palettes are very warm, very pleasant, very appealing, yet sometimes very lively in that sense. Um, let's see. Oh my God, there are so many pop-ups on this crazy on these crazy sites. Then let's look of Diego Rivera, another great realism artist, of the realism movement artist. Again, he just presents us with simple, relaxed moments. People who are doing their everyday activities, mm, events that happen in the background. They're not significant to a specific time and moment. They're just a fleeting moment in time. And his art is more akin to murals, which in a way, oops, I think I need to click the other button, this one. In a way, it tells a story, but it's a very general story. It's not presenting it as a historical moment. I keep clicking the pictures. Anyway, this one looks a little bit like Obama, but in a good way. And yet you see all the curves, all the lines, all the depictions, everything is just unique and calm and interesting. Then let's look at another artist, Honoré Daumier, who, again, we recognize his paintings from Quixote. He was also very controversial. He was presenting France of that time in more of a cartoonish way. So all of these artists, what did they have in common? They were very vulgar. They were going against the system. They were presenting things from a new element that defined defied the traditionalists. And here we have a drunk who's sleeping. Like, who wants to see this? This is nothing poetic, nothing inspirational, at least for the people of that time. It's just a belligerent drunk who just sleeps down. But when we get into the composition, when we get into the story, it's just wow. Especially later when more and more people start to see the poetic values and the rhetoric and his um, what are these? These are caricature. This is caricature of they're mocking various historical events. So it's like a mockery of art in face of all of the great classicists. And then we get to one of my most favorite artists, Vincent. And you're going to say pronounce his name very wrong because he was Dutch, and his name is pronounced correctly Vincent van Gogh, not Van Gogh or something like that. It's Vincent van Gogh. Van Gogh. And once you're gonna learn his pronunciation, every time you're going to hear it different, it's gonna scratch your brains out. But why is he one of my favorites? He he went way out of his way to create art. Well, he didn't actually went out of his way. It was his natural way of painting because the poor guy had a lot of had some mental difficulties, and there were the medical or the psychological fields of that time were not so developed. So he was suffering from possibly dementia or who knows. But in I believe there was, and this is just my opinion, there was some form of autism that made him see art and paint art differently than everyone else. And he was actually a friend of Paul Gauguin, and this guy was notoriously mental. And they had an argument once, and Paul Gauguin is actually the reason why Vincent cut off his ear, well, part of his ear. But that in combination with the fact that he was becoming increasingly confused due to his mental degradation. And yet again, Vincent managed to bring us some of the most amazing art out there. He was not recognized during his lifetime. He never managed to sell any of his painting aside from one that was sold to his brother, and his brother was very supportive of him. His brother really cared about his brother. His I mean siblings. And the cool thing, one of the coolest paintings that I like from Vincent is the Night Cafe in France. Well, he did multiple variations, but this one, the interior one, I love the most. And he wasn't rich or anything, so he had to live on a budget most of the time. So he would paint wherever he could. Since he could not hire models, he would do a lot of auto portraits. He did not have a lot of money to buy um, a lot of materials to paint with, so he was using yarn, well, different colors yarns to match the colors that he thought would go with one another. So we see the bright oranges and the reds and the greens, like amazing colors that have that complement each other to create this unique background image. I don't know. Sometimes I kind of get lost in my own words, but you even see there is this painting within a painting. It's so amazing, you know. And we can see this moment where like everybody's chilling, they're having their own intimate time, they're discussing in a calm atmosphere. Everything is so light up, and if we look closely, we kind of see there is no symmetry here. The room feels like it's deforming, it's falling within itself at one point. Nothing is symmetrical. There is like no. This clock is not very circular. Uh, and then we have this deformation of the table. So we're kind of getting a distorted. Well, possibly it's how he started seeing due to his condition, but more or less we're getting a filter effect where it's like a barrel effect in a way in photography, where we get this personal point of view of how we're looking from within ourselves outwards to the world, and we perceive this room where we are within the room when it's very personal. um, and of course you have the Starry Nights, which is the most recognized of them all. But actually, another underrated pictures of his is this guy, the Potato Eaters, which is very dark, very grim, but again with commoner people, and all they're doing is just enjoying a moment by eating together. It's a social or family activity, yet very personal. Everything about this is very personal when it comes to his art style. And then the Starry Nights, I think this is the moment where we are presented with his most intimate and conflicting moment of his life. It's a very beautiful composition and very swirly. And I don't have the vocabulary to cover the impression this l- l- brings out in within us. But the dark tower, the complementary dark bluish background. Oh my God! Stop spamming me. And all of these steep hills and churches and buildings and so on. They're just there to punch a hole through you. And in a way, we all of us artists have a bit of autism because, well, let's not say autism is necessarily the thing that can impact us in a negative way in our lives. I'm talking in small doses. Of course, extreme autism can, and I'm not a medic or anything, so I cannot proclaim that I know how this condition affects people with severe autism. But from my personal perspective, autism is something that puts us in a trance, and it can become sort of mm, amazing and intoxicating. It's an intoxicating feeling that we cannot pull out of. We just have to do it. It's something that has to be completed, and we're like an antenna. We transmit that feeling through our art. Well, by our actions, of course. And to put in comparison to Vincent van Gogh, another great artist, this time a musician that we have talked about previously, Niccolo Paganini, which was an Italian composer. They lived around the same time, I believe. And he's on the opposite side of the spectrum. He was obsessed by his music, by the composition of his music. And unlike Vincent, he actually made a huge fortune and he brought a lot of envy from people. But all he did was to overcome his ability to always impress himself first of what he could really do. And of course, you all know the story where he was rumored to have sold his soul to the devil because how amazing his compositions were, and even his critics started to appreciate his art. And of course, again, he was also cursed by various illnesses that degraded his health to the point where he could barely stand and talk and so on. But I think part of that devil thing was based on his looks because the treatments that he was taking at that time with mercury poisoning and so on were very, very noticeable. And it affected his mind and the way he was walking and trying to talk and so on. And people saw him very peculiar. But even against all his odds, he was a very optimistic person. And he did not give up against all of these difficulties. He wanted to pursue his greatest dreams to be, well, not necessarily appreciated or worshipped for his art, but he wanted to present to the world, to as much of the world as possible, his own idea. So in his art, he was part of the idealism movement as well, partially. Whereas Vincent eventually succumbed to his illnesses, and well, not his illnesses. I think he shot himself in the chest, which is a poetic death, in my opinion. But I think he did that because he started to stop making sense of reality. So he went too much into the extreme related to his vision of art, to the point where he became too alienated. So if we do not find that balance, and of course, if you're suffering from something that's related to a mental condition, always reach out for professional help and support from those around you, of course, to to help you get through those moments. But these people didn't have that luxury at that time, and the, the medical system wasn't so developed, and of course they unfortunately succumb to these consequences. The idea is that we can go sometimes in our own extremes and isolate ourselves from reality and push ourselves too much, and then it's very difficult to bring ourselves back into what's real. There is a threshold that we should be aware. The moment we blur that threshold and we forget it exists, that thing that we try to present through our vulgarity is going to consume us. So always try to keep in mind where you want to set up the limits. If you go past those limits and you know you can't come back, then that can become dangerous. Well, I hope you know liked my little ramble here. I'm not trying to be 100% accurate in all of my presentations. I'm not a history channel. So I'm trying to avoid dates and things that are very strict related to art and to their events. So I'm trying to put specific moments from history that I find them interesting, and maybe it raises your curiosity to find out more about what revolved about these people that are not very different from you and me. I mean, these people that invented this amazing art are not even 200 years older than us in time periods, of course. So we're like 5 generations later, 6, depending when you're born. But the idea is these simple people created amazing art, and they have been forgotten by history in that period, but later on they have been recognized. So if you have a dream, if you love what you do, don't give up, because obviously I'm not saying put yourself at risk and your livelihood, but follow your dreams. And if art is one of those dreams, don't give up on it so easily. Well, have an amazing day, night, or whatever you have there, and catch you guys later. See ya. Bye 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 bye.